This simple, powerful cube, it's got to be one of the most recognizable structures on the entire planet. For billions of people, it's literally the center of their world, the direction they pray, a symbol of pure monotheism. But its story? Well, it's so much older. And its original purpose? It was actually this brilliant solution to a problem that just hammered the ancient world. How do you create order, and maybe even wealth, in a land that has no kings?
Yeah, that powerful symbolism can sometimes, it can hide a really deep and complex history. So to truly get a handle on its significance, how it became what we see today, we've got to peel back those layers. We have to ask the big historical question. What was this place before Islam? And to answer that, we need to kind of shift our perspective. We're not going to look at the Kaaba as just a religious object. No. For this deep dive, we're going to approach it like historians. We're going to analyze it as a social institution, something that was deeply, deeply embedded in the laws, the economy, and the power networks of ancient Arabia. This is a story about economics, politics, and some really ancient traditions. So, here's the plan for how we're going to uncover this hidden history. First, we'll dig into the ancient rulebook that governed the whole thing. Then, we'll check out the incredible economic and political power it created. After that, we'll look inside at the crowded house of gods it once was. We'll also see its surprising role in a bigger geopolitical game. And finally, we'll see how Islam didn't just invent this place, but completely transformed it. Let's get into it. All right, Section 1, the Ancient Sanctuary Rulebook. We're going to deconstruct the foundations of this sacred space. And yeah, first things first. To really understand the Kaaba, we need to get our heads around the basic, you can almost call it an operating system it ran on. See, its rules and its functions, they weren't unique, not at all. They were actually part of a much older, really widespread tradition for creating sacred and maybe more importantly, safe spaces in a very dangerous world.
The key concept here, the word you really need to know, is haram. So in pre-Islamic Arabia, a haram was this protected, sacred zone. Think of it like a sacred bubble where the normal rules just didn't apply. Inside its boundaries, all tribal feuds, all violence was completely forbidden. It was a space of total neutrality where different, often warring tribes could meet safely. They were all under the sacred law that was way more powerful than their own endless cycles of revenge. It's kind of like a divinely enforced DMZ, a demilitarized zone. And check this out. This wasn't some isolated idea. The Kaaba was absolutely part of a much bigger ancient pattern. This whole concept of a protected sanctuary that's also a hub for pilgrimage and trade, it wasn't just an Arabian thing. You see really similar models with the Greek temenos. Think of places like Delphi, or even the temple precinct in Jerusalem. So what this shows us is that the Kaaba was basically playing by a well-known rulebook from the ancient Near East. It was using a tried-and-true method for how you use sacred space to create social order.
Okay, so let's try to picture the actual building. And you've got to erase that grand image we all have in our minds today. It was really different. Historical accounts tell us the pre-Islamic Kaaba was probably a pretty simple, unroofed enclosure. The walls were low, maybe just a bit above your head. It was constantly evolving, a real work in progress. It was even rebuilt right around 608 CE, and get this, they used wood from a wrecked Byzantine ship and brought in Ethiopian carpenters to help. So this was not some static, unchanging monument. It was a living, breathing site. Now, at the absolute heart of the Kaaba rituals, both then and now, is the black stone. And to really get what it meant back then, we've got to put on our anthropologist hats for a second and talk about something called a Bethel. It comes from the Semitic words for house of God, Bethel. And a Bethel was basically a sacred stone. It wasn't carved to look like anything, it was aniconic. It was just venerated as a physical place where the divine was present, like a direct conduit between heaven and earth. And here's the thing, the black stone was not some weird one-off, not at all. I mean, just look at the nearby city of Petra, the Nabatean capital. Their chief god, Dushara, was represented by, you guessed it, a big, uncarved black block. This practice of venerating sacred stones was super common all across the Semitic world. So the black stone was part of the shared sacred landscape, a tradition that, and this is going to be a recurring theme, Islam would later reinterpret and build upon. It's our first big clue that we're talking about reclaiming something, not just inventing it out of thin air. Okay, next up, pilgrimage, power, and time. We're looking at the economic and political engine of Mecca. So we've established this neutral sacred space, the haram, right? And it's got this revered stone at its heart. The big question now is, how does that sacred geography turn into actual, real-world power? Let's dig into how this institution built an incredible economic and political system that basically made Mecca the center of its world. It all starts with the safety of the haram. That safety is what made the annual pilgrimage even possible. And that pilgrimage, well, it was the absolute foundation of Mecca's entire economy. It created this huge, predictable annual market. This was the one time and place you could have intertribal trade, you could settle your debts, you could have this amazing cultural exchange. See, Mecca's power wasn't from having a big army or fertile land. Its power came from this totally unique ability to generate economic stability through a shared ritual. Now, for you history buffs out there, there's actually been a really interesting debate among scholars about just how big this trade was. The famous historian Patricia Crone, she made a big splash arguing that Mecca wasn't this massive international spice hub that some later traditions made it out to be. And while a lot of scholars today see her point, the consensus now is that the evidence for a really strong regional trade, a trade completely fueled by the pilgrimage, is just undeniable. This place was the economic heart of Western Arabia, no question.
But wait a second. This brings up a huge practical problem. The calendar the Arabs were using was purely lunar, right? And a lunar calendar drifts against the seasons by about 11 days every single year. Now, if you're a trader, that's a disaster. You can't have your biggest market of the year falling in the brutal summer heat one decade and then in the nice, cool harvest season the next. You need things to be predictable. So, how in the world did they solve this massive scheduling headache?
The answer was this incredibly clever system called nasi, which just means intercalation. Here's how it worked. The custodians of the Kaa'ba, the Quraysh tribe, would just declare a 13th leap month every so often. This brilliant bit of ancient admin was basically a reset button. It would snap the drifting lunar calendar right back in line with the solar seasons. And the result? The pilgrimage and that all-important market always happened at the exact same convenient time year after year.
And this is the absolute key takeaway here. Controlling the calendar meant controlling the economy. It was a huge form of power. By deciding when the sacred month started and stopped, when that extra leap month got added, by deciding when the pilgrimage happened, the Quraysh basically controlled the entire economic rhythm of the whole region. This gave them unbelievable prestige and a ton of leverage over every other tribe that relied on that Meccan market.
All right, let's move on to our next section, a crowded house of gods, looking at the religious pluralism inside the sanctuary. So let's step inside, shall we? We know this place had to serve a ton of different tribes, so what did that religious landscape actually look like? The simple answer is, it was crowded. It was like a shared house for this huge, diverse spiritual family. So, later Islamic sources tell us the Kaa'ba housed hundreds of idols. Hundreds. Among the big names were Hubal, who was the main god of the ruling Quraysh tribe, and those three famous goddesses, Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. But it wasn't just them. It also had idols representing countless other tribes from all over the Arabian Peninsula. It was a truly multicultural sanctuary, kind of like a spiritual safe deposit box, where every single tribe could have their connection to the divine right there in a physical home. And this is a super important point that historians make. Just because all these idols were in one place, it doesn't mean there was some unified theology, like they were all part of one big happy family of gods. Not even close. It simply meant that the sanctuary was, for lack of a better term, open for business to anyone, no matter who their specific patron god was. It was all about ritual inclusivity. It was a practical solution because this multi-tribal pilgrimage site had to serve everyone if it was going to survive. So you're probably wondering, okay, where does Allah fit into this picture? Well, the scholarly consensus is that the name Allah was already well known and definitely associated with the Kaa'ba. He was often seen as this high creator god, maybe even the lord of the sanctuary. But, and this is a huge but, he was not the exclusive focus of worship, not by a long shot. Most of the day-to-day worship went to all those other deities who were seen as go-betweens or intercessors. And this is so crucial to understand. The big innovation of Islam wasn't inventing the idea of Allah. It was demanding that all worship be directed exclusively to him. That was the radical reinterpretation of an existing tradition. Okay, time to zoom out for the big picture with our next section, a geopolitical fault line, or the Kaa'ba on the world stage. Because this incredibly powerful place in Mecca, it didn't exist in a bubble. By the 6th century, it was sitting smack dab on a fault line between the two great superpowers of the day, the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Empire. And pretty soon, it found itself right in the crosshairs of a major geopolitical fight. Now, you gotta remember, Western Arabia was different from places like Persia or Yemen. It had no kings, no standing armies, no real formal state. It was a power vacuum, and the Kaa'ba is what filled that vacuum. Being the custodians of the sanctuary
gave the Quraysh this incredible symbolic authority. They couldn't force anyone to do anything, but they didn't have to. They weren't emperors. Think of them more like the respected masters of ceremony for all of Arabia. And that status alone gave them huge influence. But that authority was about to be challenged big time. Down in Yemen, the Christian ruler, a guy named Abraha who was backed by the Ethiopian and Byzantine empires, he builds this massive, stunning cathedral. And his goal was no secret. He wanted to create a new center for pilgrimage and basically steal all that valuable Arabian trade away from the pagan Kaaba. And this leads to the famous Year of the Elephant, when Abraha's army, with its elephants, marched on Mecca. You have to see this for what it was. It was a proxy war between the imperial ambitions of the Christian empires and the independent, homegrown tradition that Mecca represented. And all of this brings us to the final and most crucial part of our story. Section 5, Reclaiming, Not Inventing, looking at Islam's transformation of this ancient institution. So we've seen the Kaaba as a legal sanctuary, an economic engine, a timekeeper, and a geopolitical symbol. The big question is, how did the rise of Islam engage with this already powerful, pre-existing institution? Well, the answer comes back to that theme we've been talking about all along: reclaiming and redefining.
Now, before we go further, a quick but really important point. You might be sitting there thinking, okay, this is great, but where is the archaeology? Where are the digs? And the simple answer is, there aren't any. The Kaaba has been in continuous sacred use for more than 1,400 years, which makes any kind of archaeological dig impossible. And this isn't weird or suspicious. It's actually pretty common for major religious sites. It's the same situation at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem or St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It just means that for this story, historians have to rely on a really careful reading of the texts and on comparing the Kaaba to similar ancient institutions we do know about. And this table really just lays it all out perfectly. What Islam did was this radical act of both continuity and rupture. Look at the continuity. The function of a sanctuary, the ḥaram, kept it. The practice of pilgrimage, the Hajj, kept that too, and even made it a central pillar of the faith. But then comes the rupture. The pluralistic theology? Gone. The idols were removed. The whole idea of praying through intercessors was eliminated. And the very meaning of the Kaaba was completely redefined. It went from being a regional hub for many different tribes to becoming the universal center for one single global monotheistic community. And getting your head around that transformation is absolutely key to understanding the early success and lasting power of Islam. So, let's pull all these threads together. Before Islam, the Kaaba was so much more than just a temple. It was this incredibly sophisticated social machine that solved the problem of how to have order in a society without a state. It created authority where there was no king. It generated economic stability through its pilgrimage, and it provided this priceless neutral ground that was governed by sacred law and, maybe most importantly of all, by a controlled calendar. And if there's one thing you take away from this, let it be this. Islam did not invent the Kaaba out of whole cloth. It took this ancient, incredibly powerful, and deeply meaningful institution that already existed, and it reclaimed it. It kept the core functions, the sanctuary, the pilgrimage, its central importance, and then it purified it of the idols and completely redefined its purpose. It transformed it from a pluralistic regional sanctuary into the exclusive universal center of worship for one God.
The history of the Kaaba really is this incredible story of continuity and revolutionary change. So let me know what you think. Comment if you've noticed the echoes of these ancient practices before, maybe in other cultures or religions. I'll be breaking down more topics just like this. I'd love to read your thoughts. Thanks for watching.